Welcome, dear listener, to another long and winding tale from history. The kind of tale that drifts slowly, with no hurry, no noise, and certainly no reason to keep you awake. Tonight, we wander into the shaded lanes and dusty courtyards of medieval Chinese villages, small, ordinary places where life moved to the rhythm of farming, festivals, and family duties. But behind this calm surface, there existed curious little customs, and sometimes peculiar punishments. These were not the grand executions or dramatic court rulings of emperors, but the quiet, strange, and often amusing village practices, meant to correct everyday mischief. A man who refused to share water at the well, a woman who quarreled too loudly in the market, or a boy caught stealing chickens each could find themselves facing punishments that were neither terrible nor merciful, but something in between. Something peculiar enough to become a story. So, settle in. Let the worries of your day slip away, and let the slow rhythm of old village life carry you towards sleep. We will explore forgotten corners of history where punishments were not just penalties, but also performances for the community, carried out with a curious blend of order, humor, and tradition. In the hushed stillness of medieval China, far from the palaces of emperors and the bustling avenues of great cities, lay the quiet villages where most people spent their entire lives. These were places of bamboo fences and tiled roofs, where the air often smelled faintly of wood smoke and boiled rice, and where the rhythm of existence was set not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun. A village in those days was not merely a collection of houses. It was a living body, its people bound together by shared rituals, unspoken rules, and an ever-present awareness of harmony. The Confucian ideal of order, respect, and balance seeped even into the smallest details of life. A man who bowed too shallowly to an elder could be whispered about for weeks. A child who neglected to sweep the family courtyard might be chastised not just by his parents, but by neighbors who felt it their duty to maintain the moral fabric of the village. Life was humble but structured. Mornings often began with the low clatter of buckets as women carried water from the well, or the rustling of straw hats as farmers set off to tend the rice fields. Children trailed behind, some carrying baskets, some simply watching and learning. Afternoons carried the drone of insects, the slow turning of millstones, and the laughter of young apprentices running errands. By nightfall, oil lamps glowed, faintly behind paper screens, casting long, soft shadows, while families shared bowls of rice or warm broth. Yet beneath this sense of calm lay a truth. Where there is community, there must also be discipline. Small disputes and quarrels were inevitable. A farmer might argue with his neighbor about the boundary of a field. A woman might scold another for taking too much from the communal well. Even children could stir trouble by damaging tools, stealing fruit, or taunting animals in the street. In such cases, the village elders were expected to act not with harsh cruelty, but with remedies that restored balance, and so emerged the peculiar punishments. They were not grand decrees, but simple practices rooted in old custom. These punishments were often carried out in the open, not to break the offender, but to remind the community of shared values. They could be embarrassing, sometimes humorous, sometimes oddly theatrical, but always carefully measured so as not to sow hatred or lasting harm. A villager caught quarreling too loudly might be made to sit for an entire afternoon on the steps of the ancestral shrine, holding a placard around his neck that read, "I disturbed the peace." A youth who shirked his duties in the fields might be ordered to sweep the market square for 3 mornings in a row. A gossip who spread false tales could be paraded through the lanes with a bamboo basket on her head, so that all would know and laugh gently at her folly. The intent was never to destroy one's dignity, but to bruise it just enough to encourage reflection. And for the onlookers, the punishments became part of the life of the village, an odd kind of entertainment, mingled with moral instruction. Children giggled, elders shook their heads knowingly, and neighbors often discussed whether the punishment had been fair or whether, perhaps, the offender had deserved a sterner one. Thus, in these villages, the law was not written in thick scrolls or enforced by distant magistrates. It was carried in memory, spoken in the gathering at the tea house, and lived in the rituals of everyday correction. Punishments might appear peculiar to our modern eyes, but in their time, they were threads that held the fabric of communal life together, gentle binding, and quietly effective. Life in those rural corners of medieval China unfolded in slow, deliberate rhythms, and it was within these rhythms that justice took its most peculiar forms. To understand why the punishments in these villages appeared so unusual to us today, one must first imagine the everyday atmosphere in which they existed. Villagers rose at dawn to the crowing of roosters, swept their earthen courtyards, stoked the fires in clay stoves, and tended to rice paddies or small vegetable plots. Their lives were framed by necessity: food, water, shelter, survival. Within such a world, the law was not a distant concept delivered by imperial decree, but a living thing that sat within the heart of the community. The headmen, sometimes joined by respected elders, presided over matters with a blend of Confucian moral reasoning, Taoist pragmatism, and long-standing local customs that had been handed down like folk tales. These punishments were rarely about cruelty alone. More often, they carried lessons, warnings meant not only for the offender, but for all who watched. A punishment could unfold in the village square, where the shade of a great old tree cast a solemn air, and neighbors gathered not in excitement, but in the slow, patient stillness of observers who knew that such moments were part of the natural order. The accused might be brought forward with little ceremony, perhaps a farmer who had neglected his irrigation duties, causing another's fields to wither, or a young man accused of speaking disrespectfully to his elders. Even these small acts were taken seriously, for they threatened the harmony upon which village life depended. The punishments themselves often combined practicality with symbolism. For instance, one common method involved forcing the guilty party to kneel for hours on dried millet seeds or rough wooden planks. To an outsider this might seem mild, almost trivial, yet those who have experienced it knew that the sharp edges pressed into the knees and shins with a relentless ache, producing a pain that was not violent, but enduring, meant to humble rather than harm. The public setting ensured that shame accompanied the discomfort, binding physical pain with social embarrassment. There were other punishments rooted in ridicule, designed not with whips or chains, but with costumes and rituals. A thief might be made to wear a wooden board around his neck, wide enough to prevent lying down or turning comfortably. The villagers called it the kang, a portable frame of humiliation, often inscribed with the misdeed in bold characters for all to read. Offenders stood or shuffled awkwardly through the market lanes, watched by women buying vegetables and children who pointed with a mixture of fear and fascination. It was not just the weight of wood they carried, but the heavy knowledge that every neighbor had witnessed their disgrace. In some villages, a different form of punishment blended punishment with community service. Those who had wronged others were tasked with repairing irrigation ditches, sweeping temple courtyards, or carrying water jars for elderly residents. The work was arduous and public, a way of demonstrating repentance through service. These punishments reflected a belief that wrongdoings disturbed the balance of collective life, and balance could only be restored by physical contributions that benefited everyone. The act of labor itself became both penance and remedy, a visible stitching of the torn fabric of trust. Equally peculiar were punishments that leaned on symbolic inversion, turning ordinary life on its head. A gossiping woman, for example, might be instructed to stand in the center of the square with her mouth stuffed with reeds or cloth, as though silenced by her own words. A quarrelsome man might be forced to wear his clothing inside out, paraded before others as a figure of comic absurdity. These methods were not only clever, but deeply rooted in cultural symbolism, the punishment reflecting the offense in miniature. as though the community itself acted as a mirror. Underlying all of these practices was an unspoken principle. Punishment was not solely about the individual, but about maintaining collective harmony. Unlike the great imperial courts, where law was codified and formalized, village justice was shaped by moral example. Elders believed that the sight of a man bowed under the weight of a kang or kneeling on seeds would linger in memory far longer than the swing of a whip. And so, punishments were designed to be unforgettable, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes painful, but always instructive. They served as reminders that order was fragile and required constant tending, like the carefully balanced dikes that protected the rice paddies from floodwaters. As evening settled over these villages, one might still see the punished figure enduring their sentence. Lantern light flickering on the wooden boards, the quiet shuffle of neighbors going about their tasks. Punishments did not erupt with spectacle. They lingered quietly, part of the natural flow of community life. Just as dawn promised work in the fields, so too did dusk often reveal lessons in humility, shame, or reconciliation. And so, these peculiar punishments became woven into the very fabric of daily life, mundane to those who lived them, but strange and captivating to us who look back through time. One of the most curious aspects of village life in medieval China was how punishments were rarely confined to the individual alone. A man who had offended the community might find his punishment extending into the social fabric of his family, neighbors, and even the rituals of the market. For instance, it was not uncommon for a petty thief to be paraded through the village with a wooden placard hanging from his neck, inscribed in bold brushstrokes with the crime he had committed. Yet what is often overlooked in modern imagination is that these placards were sometimes decorated by the townspeople themselves, flourishes of ink, humorous caricatures, or poetic couplets, turning shame into a small festival of satire. The offender became both a warning and a kind of unwilling performer, his punishment woven into the communal rhythm of laughter and gossip. Equally intriguing were punishments that blurred the line between ritual and discipline. Villages might compel wrongdoers to stand in awkward postures before ancestral shrines, bowing repeatedly until their knees gave out, while elders recited maxims from Confucian texts. These displays were not intended merely to humiliate, but to reinforce the hierarchy of moral authority. The punishment was as much about reminding the entire village of proper conduct as it was about chastising a single wayward soul. Children were often gathered to watch, their parents whispering reminders that the same fate awaited them if they strayed too far from the expected path. A fascinating, though little discussed, practice involved the punishment of silence. Some offenders were forbidden from speaking in public for days or even weeks at a time. They were forced to communicate only with hand gestures, chalk markings, or the clumsy writing of characters in the dust of the street. To modern ears, this may sound oddly merciful compared to harsher penalties, yet in the tightly woven networks of rural life, where one's voice was crucial for bargaining at market stalls, for storytelling during long evenings, or for making announcements during community feasts, enforced silence was a heavy burden. The offender became present yet absent, watched yet voicelessly ghost, within the lively hum of the village square. There were also punishments tied directly to the agricultural calendar, which is particularly telling of how inseparable law and livelihood were in these communities. If a farmer neglected duties to the village granary, he might be assigned the unpleasant work of guarding the rice paddies at night, when mosquitoes thickened in the humid air. Others who shirked responsibility could be ordered to sweep the dusty lanes during festival days, ensuring that their labor was on display precisely when their neighbors were gathered in fine clothing, watching with quiet satisfaction. Such punishments, though seemingly mundane, were heavy with symbolism. Work was honor, and to be compelled into menial toil while others enjoyed rest was its own form of disgrace. Perhaps most peculiar, and at times strangely theatrical, were punishments tied to sound. In certain villages, Wrongdoers were given clappers or gongs and told to walk the streets, striking them loudly as they went. This ensured that every villager knew not only of the person's crime, but also of their physical passage through the lanes, as though their shame must ripple out like the vibrations of the instrument itself. Onlookers sometimes followed along, chuckling or shaking their heads, while children mimicked the sounds in playful imitation. The punishment blurred into performance, and performance into memory. Years later, elders might recall that so-and-so once walked with the gong, and the recollection alone carried weight long after the act had ended. Underlying all of this was a distinctly communal philosophy. Punishment was not intended to sever the wrongdoer from society, but to reintegrate them through ritualized shame and labor. Unlike prisons, which separated offenders from daily life, village punishments were woven into the very fabric of that life. The lanes, the shrines, the markets, even the harvest fields all became temporary stages for acts of correction. And while the punishments might seem peculiar or even quaint from a modern perspective, they reveal a deeper truth. Discipline in medieval Chinese villages was never purely punitive. It was, in its own way, a binding force, reminding everyone that to live in community meant not only sharing in labor and celebration, but also in the rituals of correction and reconciliation. Life in a medieval Chinese village was not simply defined by crops, seasons, and family bonds. It was also defined by the rules that bound neighbors together and the expectations placed upon them by both tradition and local authority. Punishments, therefore, were not viewed merely as acts of discipline, but as woven threads in the fabric of daily existence. They were reminders, gentle or severe, that order must prevail, even in the smallest hamlet hidden among bamboo groves or nestled at the foot of misty hills. One striking feature of these communities was the belief that public correction worked better than private reprimand. To a modern mind, the punishments might seem strange, even absurd, yet within the rhythm of village life, they carried a certain logic. The idea was less about the crime itself, and more about maintaining harmony, about ensuring that neighbors lived in peace, and about curbing any spark that could disrupt the delicate balance of rural society. Take, for example, the punishment of the mock procession. In some villages, when a man or woman was found guilty of speaking unkindly about elders or spreading unnecessary gossip, they would be paraded slowly through the lanes of the village. A wooden sign, often clumsily painted, might hang from their neck, declaring their fault in plain characters. Children, curious and delighted, followed in noisy clusters, while elders watched quietly from doorways. The punishment was not violent, nor did it cause physical harm. It was simply humiliating, designed to prick the pride of the wrongdoer and to remind everyone else of the dangers of idle talk. And yet, after the procession ended, life would return to normal. Neighbors would smile again, the offender would bow in apology, and the gossip would be left to drift away like smoke from a cooking fire. Other punishments, though still relatively mild, carried a sense of creative ingenuity. A villager who consistently ignored communal duties, such as repairing dikes or tending to shared pathways, might be ordered to sweep the market square at dawn. This was not in itself a heavy burden, but it placed the individual in plain sight of the entire community. Imagine the quiet of early morning, the cobblestones still damp with dew, the air cool, roosters crowing in the distance, and there, bent with a broom in hand, was the negligent villager, carrying out the task they had once neglected. The act became symbolic, an outward performance of responsibility, a visual assurance to the community that wrongs were being righted, not in secrecy, but in the open air. Still, punishments were not always designed with ridicule alone. At times, they were rooted in superstition, bound tightly to the beliefs that guided village life. A farmer who cheated at weights in the market might be required to kneel before the local temple, his misdeed written on a strip of paper pinned to his sleeve. This was not only a declaration to neighbors, it was a symbolic act of repentance before the spirits who watched over fields and families. The villagers believed that dishonesty did not just wound human relations, but risked offending unseen powers, perhaps even bringing bad harvests or illness. The punishment, therefore, was part social correction, part spiritual safeguarding, a way of rebalancing the world around them. The fascinating thing about these punishments is how ordinary they seemed to the villagers themselves. To them, it was not unusual that someone might wear a heavy wooden collar for a day as punishment for stealing a neighbor's chicken, nor that a mischievous boy might have to carry buckets of water from the well for hours to atone for breaking another child's toy. The weight of the collar, the sting of embarrassment, or the ache of tired arms, these were not viewed as cruelty, but as lessons, as necessary moments of discomfort meant to strengthen the bonds of community life. And, as always, these events were accompanied by a kind of ritual calm. No one shouted, no great drama unfolded. Instead, the punishments played out like scenes in the ordinary theater of village existence, observed with the same quiet attentiveness as one might watch the sowing of rice or the burning of incense. For every punishment, there was a collective understanding that once endured, it would be forgotten. Harmony mattered more than resentment, and so even the most peculiar punishments dissolved quickly into the gentle hum of daily routine. While some punishments in medieval Chinese villages were direct and severe, others leaned toward symbolic gestures that aimed to shape behavior by appealing to shame rather than pain. For example, in some rural communities, a person caught lying or spreading harmful gossip might be required to walk around the village square, carrying a large wooden placard inscribed with their offense. The placard could be heavy and awkward, forcing the offender to shuffle slowly through familiar paths while neighbors watched. Though this punishment left no physical mark, it struck deeply at the offender's sense of dignity, especially in small villages where reputation was as valuable as grain during harvest time. The act of wearing one's shame was not uncommon, and variations of this practice took many forms. Some communities would tie bundles of reeds or straw to the offender's back, transforming them into a living symbol of folly. Others made the accused wear hats of exaggerated size, painted in bright colors, so that everyone could see them from afar. These visual cues, often designed to provoke gentle mockery, served as reminders that the village valued honesty, respect, and discipline above all. In such settings, laughter was both punishment and lesson, leaving the offender eager to regain dignity through better behavior. Equally curious was the practice of assigning community chores as a form of penance. A man who shirked his duties in the fields might be forced to sweep the dusty lanes at dawn, long before his neighbors stirred from their mats. Women accused of being quarrelsome could be tasked with carrying water repeatedly from the well to the communal square, ensuring that the entire community benefited from their punishment. These acts not only corrected behavior, but also ensured that punishment created some small improvement to village life. Lanes were swept, wells stayed clean, and communal spaces remained orderly. Punishments could also take on a distinctly theatrical quality. A villager caught being lazy during harvest season might be brought before a mock court in which elders sat with solemn expressions, playing their roles with exaggerated seriousness. The offender would be questioned, scolded, and sometimes made to perform a dramatic apology in front of onlookers. Children, in particular, were often invited to watch these staged events, for the lessons were meant to ripple across generations by embedding the punishment in ritual and performance. The act became a community story retold at gatherings, whispered at festivals, and used to shape the conduct of others who might be tempted to stray. In some villages, punishments even wove themselves into local festivals. There were tales of petty thieves required to wear bells on their ankles during the New Year celebrations, clanging with every step as they joined the parade. Villagers would laugh, not with cruelty, but with recognition, for everyone knew that mistakes were part of life. Once the bells were removed, the punishment ended, and the person could step forward again as a full member of the community. This cycle of temporary exclusion and eventual reintegration was essential in small societies where survival depended on unity. Underlying all these practices was an enduring theme: the balance between justice and community harmony. Harsh punishment could fracture relationships in villages where everyone relied on one another, but too little discipline could invite disorder. Thus, punishments were designed to be memorable, but not permanently destructive. They were woven into the rhythms of daily life, visible enough to deter wrongdoing, but forgiving enough to allow redemption. In some corners of the countryside, punishments took on forms that today seem almost theatrical in their inventiveness. Villagers sometimes devised what might be called shaming rituals, rather than physical torments, for the act of humiliation itself was considered a potent correction. A petty thief might be required to wear a wooden placard strung around his neck, upon which the word thief was brushed in bold black characters. He would then be made to stand in the central market, while people passed by, shaking their heads in disapproval, sometimes with deliberate exaggeration. Such punishments, while not inflicting lasting harm, cut deeply into the fabric of reputation, which was among the most valuable possessions a person could hold in these small, closely watched communities. Another curious practice, reported in scattered records, involved the use of loud instruments, drums, gongs, or even hollow bamboo tubes to announce the disgrace of an offender. The sound was not meant to rouse fear, as in military use, but rather to create a sense of disruption. A youth caught breaking curfew might be led through the lanes at dawn, with a gong clanging beside him, each strike echoing in the quiet air, ensuring all neighbors were awake to witness his shame. In a world where harmony and order were cherished, to disturb the peace with such noise was punishment in itself. Some villages also made use of what might be described as symbolic labor. Instead of imprisoning a person or forcing heavy toil, the offender might be ordered to carry out tasks that were both visible and faintly ridiculous. There are mentions of wrongdoers being asked to sweep the paths while wearing oversized hats, or to repair walls with tools too small for the job, all in full view of neighbors. The labor itself was not the hardship, the absurdity of the spectacle was. This was discipline through mockery, a way of reminding others that misconduct, however small, had consequences that touched both body and pride. Equally striking were punishments that relied on clothing or, rather, the lack of it. Some accounts describe villagers compelling offenders to wear garments turned inside out, or robes patched with brightly contrasting fabrics that marked the wearer as foolish. In one curious example, someone guilty of spreading lies was made to wear a chicken-feathered cap, the implication being that such a person's words were as light and worthless as a feather. These sartorial punishments were not cruel, but they left an indelible impression, for every passerby could instantly recognize the nature of the offense without a word being spoken. At times, entire households bore the mark of shame. If one member committed a serious breach of trust, the family's gate might be daubed with chalk symbols, or a straw effigy placed by the entrance, signaling dishonor within. The punishment here extended beyond the individual, reminding everyone that in small communities, misdeeds were not contained, they spread outward, staining the reputation of kin and ancestors. Such communal accountability reinforced a sense of collective responsibility but also deepened the sting of error. Equally intriguing are the small, almost whimsical methods villages devised for correcting children or younger offenders, rather than harsh beatings, which were reserved for graver matters. Elders might instruct a disobedient youth to recite moral sayings aloud in the square, repeating them until voice and patience alike grew thin. Others were required to kneel before ancestral tablets, not merely as physical discomfort, but as a visible acknowledgement of their failure to uphold family virtue. These practices reveal a blending of discipline and ritual, punishment and pedagogy, all wrapped in a quiet symbolism that reflected the broader values of the society. And so, when we speak of punishments in medieval Chinese villages, we find not only rods and fines, but an array of symbolic gestures, noisy spectacles, and carefully designed embarrassments. They were not always cruel, but they were calculated, aiming at the heart of communal life, reputation, honor, and belonging. To fall outside of these was, for many, a far sharper wound than any physical blow. Life in these villages was slow and deeply patterned, not only by the seasons, but by customs that were as firm as the stones lining the fields. Every gesture, every exchange of words, even the smallest act of politeness, was framed by expectations that had been passed down from one generation to the next. And when those expectations were not met, when someone stepped outside of the shared rhythm of daily life, the community reached for remedies that might seem unusual to us now. For instance, there were symbolic punishments tied not to pain, but to embarrassment. A villager who repeatedly ignored communal duties, such as helping to repair irrigation ditches or keeping pathways clear, might find themselves compelled to stand at the crossroads of the settlement with a carved wooden plaque around their neck. These plaques were painted with simple words: idle, neglectful, or dishonest, written in broad, visible strokes. The punishment was not violent, but it weighed heavily on the culprit, for reputation was the lifeblood of a villager. A man who carried such a sign even for a day might feel the gaze of neighbors for weeks afterward, a quiet reminder to return to his responsibilities. Other punishments took on a performative quality, half discipline and half ritual. In some areas, a person who had spoken too harshly to elders might be required to kneel on the hard stones of the temple courtyard during morning prayers. They were not ignored while doing so. Villagers walked past them, often nodding politely, as if to acknowledge both the offense and the act of contrition. These small displays folded discipline into the daily rhythm, making the correction visible, yet also temporary, so the offender could be reabsorbed into community life without lasting bitterness. Certain punishments reflected the agricultural world in which villagers lived. A young man accused of boasting too much, for example, might be sent to guard a field at night alone. The task itself was not harsh, keeping watch over rice paddies or vegetable plots to scare away animals, but the solitude was heavy. Long hours passed under the moonlight, with only the sound of insects and the rustle of distant reeds. The punishment worked less through public humiliation and more through reflection, as the stillness of the night encouraged the punished to measure his pride against the vast quiet of the natural world. There were also curious practices involving food. In some villages, a person who had been caught stealing small amounts of grain might be punished by being fed nothing but plain rice gruel for several days. The community provided the food, so the punishment was not starvation, but it carried a symbolic sting. The thief, who had reached for more than his share, was reduced to the barest and most monotonous meal. Stories say that after such punishments, those who had once been greedy often came to savor even the simplest offerings, their appetites tempered by enforced restraint. These methods, though peculiar by modern standards, were not born of cruelty alone. Rather, they reflected a belief that wrongdoing upset the harmony of the group, and that restoring balance required acts visible to all. Punishments were public, but they were also finite, allowing the offender to return once their debt to the community had been symbolically repaid. In this way, medieval Chinese villages managed discipline through gestures that were often small, sometimes theatrical, and always grounded in the rhythms of communal life. And it is in this tapestry of customs woven from fields, temples, family ties, and the expectations of neighbors that the peculiar punishments of these villages become most striking. They were less about authority from above, and more about the everyday effort of people living close together, trying to keep order without tearing the fabric of trust that bound them. The perception of punishment in medieval Chinese villages was never as straightforward as a simple act of retribution. It was woven into the rhythm of life, like planting rice, repairing a roof, or brewing medicinal teas. To outsiders, some of the methods might have seemed eccentric or even petty, but to those within the village walls, each act carried layers of meaning, an echo of order and continuity in a world where change came slowly. For villagers, punishments were not always about pain or fear, but about restoring a sense of harmony, of reminding everyone that their actions affected the collective fabric of the community. In many such villages, disputes often began with something seemingly trivial: a farmer accused of letting his chickens stray into another's field, or a merchant suspected of tipping his scales ever so slightly in his favor. These were not crimes, in the grand sense, but they were disruptions to the delicate trust that held people together. And so, the punishments devised were equally small in scale, yet symbolically large. Instead of a harsh sentence, one might be required to sweep the communal road at dawn for a month, his back bent in the mist as neighbors passed by, each step a reminder of his misdeed. Other punishments took on a theatrical quality. A man who gossiped too freely might find himself forced to stand in the village square with a wooden plaque hanging from his neck, its surface inscribed with crude characters declaring his offense. It was not unusual for children to laugh, for elders to shake their heads knowingly, and for the offender himself to lower his gaze in embarrassment. The punishment was rarely about permanent. Shamit was about the temporary sting that would persuade him to think twice before wagging his tongue again. There was also an odd kind of artistry in how these penalties were designed. Villages were creative spaces, and punishments reflected that creativity. A woman caught watering down wine she sold to travelers might be made to carry 2 buckets of river water, not for an hour, but for days, circling the market square until the act became as much spectacle as correction. The sight of her trudging in silence, water sloshing with each step, was both a lesson and a form of entertainment. Children followed along, and neighbors smiled knowingly it was punishment. Yes, but punishment softened by the slow rhythm of communal life. And yet, beneath the surface, these punishments carried a more serious weight. In societies where records were scarce and law enforcement distant, the memory of the people became the record. A punishment was not simply for the individual, it was a message preserved in the minds of all who witnessed it. The image of a villager kneeling before the ancestral shrine as a form of penance, incense smoke curling around his bowed head, was remembered by the community far longer than a private scolding behind closed doors would have been. The ancestral shrines, too, played a role in punishment. For minor transgressions, a person might be asked to sweep the courtyard of the shrine for days, carefully tending the incense burners, scrubbing the stone floors, and polishing the offerings table. This was not merely labor, it was a spiritual cleansing, a way of acknowledging one's mistake before both the living and the spirits of the dead. To neglect one's duties at the shrine was considered a misdeed in itself, so for an offender, the task was as humbling as it was demanding. Even animals sometimes found their place in these rituals of correction. If a villager's donkey damaged another's crops, it was not uncommon for the animal itself to be tied in the square with a wooden placard declaring, "This beast trampled the fields." The absurdity of punishing a donkey was not lost on the people, but it served as a sharp reminder to the owner to take better care of his responsibilities. The animal, placid and uncomprehending, stood as a living symbol of the consequences of negligence. The rhythm of these punishments was unhurried, much like life itself. There was rarely a rush to resolve disputes. Instead, punishments unfolded slowly, sometimes over days or weeks, their lessons absorbed gradually. Villagers saw these acts not as cruel intrusions, but as ordinary features of the social landscape, like the cycles of planting and harvest. The punishments, in their peculiar forms, became part of the very character of village life, quiet, memorable, and undeniably human. In many ways, the punishments of medieval Chinese villages reflected the rhythm of the seasons themselves. In times of harvest, when grain was plentiful and the air smelled of drying stalks. Punishments often carried an agricultural symbolism. A thief caught stealing rice might be sentenced not only to return what he had taken, but also to sit for days beside the threshing floor, under the watchful eye of the entire village, wearing a garland of broken rice stalks around his neck. The straw collar was not painful, but it marked him as someone who had violated the sacred bond of trust that allowed a village to share labor and food. Each passerby, seeing the man seated quietly with bowed head, was reminded that prosperity depended upon fairness as much as toil. Winter, by contrast, brought its own curious punishments. With fields barren and labor lightened, villages had time to be more creative or more theatrical. One of the punishments occasionally recorded was the ice stool. A wrongdoer, often guilty of slander or spreading disruptive rumors, might be made to sit outside upon a block of frozen earth or ice cut from a pond. Bundled only in his ordinary clothing, he was kept there for a period of hours, while elders ensured that he was never in true danger of freezing, but uncomfortable enough to reflect on the sharpness of his tongue. Such a punishment was temporary, leaving no scars, but it carried with it a memorable chill. Old sayings in some regions compared gossip to frosted, spreads unseen, and leaves damage behind end, so the symbolism was not lost on the community. Punishments also varied, depending upon whether one was judged as acting out of ignorance, arrogance, or malice. For example, a young boy who neglected to bow before the ancestral tablets during a festival might be made to kneel with a candle in each hand until the wax burned low. He was not harmed, but the act served as a solemn reminder of the respect due to one's ancestors and to the rituals that bound the community together. A grown man who openly mocked the same rituals, however, might face something harsher, being paraded through the streets, carrying the very altar he had insulted, forced to balance it on his shoulders, while others sang verses about reverence and humility. It is important to remember that medieval Chinese villages were not without humor, even in their punishments. Many records mention punishments that were deliberately embarrassing, almost playful in their design. A woman who quarreled endlessly with her neighbors might be made to wear a clay pot on her head, with a hole cut out so she could see, and a painted phrase like "mouth too loud" written on the surface. Children would laugh, and even the accused herself might later retell the story with amusement. In this way, the punishment functioned not only to correct, but also to lighten the mood of the entire village, transforming conflict into laughter. Village squares, open-air courtyards, and temple steps often served as the stage for such punishments. They were as much about community participation as they were about the guilty party. An elder would announce the offense and the chosen punishment, not with malice but with calm authority, reminding all present that these rituals were intended to restore harmony. The sight of villagers gathering quietly, their hands folded, watching as a punishment was enacted, would have felt less like a spectacle of cruelty and more like a ceremony of balance where disharmony was identified, acknowledged, and slowly smoothed away. We also see in some accounts that punishments were deliberately temporary, designed never to leave lasting harm. After a thief returned what was stolen, after a gossip endured the chill of the ice stool, after a quarrelsome villager wore her clay pot in the square, life went on as before. Neighbors invited one another for tea, children played in the lanes, and the marketplace buzzed with ordinary trade. The punishments were not about permanent exclusion, but about gently steering someone back into the flow of village life. These practices, in their quiet inventiveness, remind us that human societies often find unusual ways to keep order, and in the hushed rhythm of village life, where the ringing of a temple bell or the cawing of crows could mark the hours, even the strangest punishments became simply another part of the daily cycle, a moment of correction, soon absorbed back into the steady current of existence. As Section 1 gently closes with the quiet image of villagers murmuring about punishments, Section 2 begins by widening the lens, allowing us to step deeper into the everyday world of medieval Chinese communities. Imagine again the dusty lanes of a rural settlement, where chickens peck near the threshold of wooden homes, and where the faint clang of a distant blacksmith blends with the chatter of women carrying buckets from the well. These were not places where one could hide from judgment. Punishments were designed to be seen, to be witnessed by neighbors, family, and strangers alike. For villagers, life was communal, woven together like a mat of straw. Everyone's behavior carried weight, because misdeeds reflected not only on an individual, but on their household and, in some cases, the entire community. That is why punishments were often performed in open spaces, deliberately placed at crossroads, markets, or even just outside a village gate. The wide dirt square at the center of a hamlet became a kind of stage, where discipline was not whispered, but shown like a lesson written on parchment for all to read. One of the peculiar practices that emerged was the use of the kanga heavy, wooden collar locked around the neck of an offender. More than an instrument of pain, it was a tool of visibility. A villager wearing such a collar could hardly move, could not lie down easily, and was forced to endure the curious, sometimes mocking gazes of neighbors. Imagine the awkward weight pressing on one's shoulders, while still being expected to walk to the well or sit outside a shop. The kang turned the simplest movements drinking, scratching an itch, even turning the head into a humiliating ordeal, and its purpose was clear: to make the punishment linger in the memory of all who saw it. These punishments were not always brutal in a physical sense. Instead, they played on embarrassment, on discomfort, on the subtle power of social pressure. To be shamed in front of others was often worse than a swift strike of the cane, for shame lingered long after wood splinters or bruises had healed. The gossip of neighbors was as sharp as any punishment itself, and for villagers, reputation was as valuable as food. In markets, where sellers arranged neat rows of vegetables and bundles of grain, an offender might be placed on display during the busiest hours, ensuring that their misstep became the talk of the day. Shoppers bartering for cabbages or dried fish would whisper about the person standing under the watchful eyes of elders, and even those who pretended not to notice would carry the story back to their homes. Punishment, in this way, stretched beyond the offender. It was absorbed into the very rhythm of community life. The village became both stage and audience, a place where law, custom, and spectacle merged into one. And while punishments may appear odd to us now, to those who lived then, they were ordinary, woven into the fabric of how order was maintained. If the kang was a punishment that drew attention by sheer weight and awkwardness, other practices leaned instead on the quiet symbolism of posture and stillness. A common method of correction was compulsory kneeling. To kneel on rough ground outside one's home, or at the steps of a temple, was to embody humility before neighbors, ancestors, and the gods alike. Villagers would sometimes pass by silently, their faces neither cruel nor sympathetic, acknowledging the posture as a reminder that humility was the proper shape of the human body in moments of wrongdoing. In some hamlets, the kneeling was done on woven mats of reeds, but in stricter communities, offenders were placed upon stones or even dried beans spread across the earth. These small, hard shapes pressed into the skin, prolonging discomfort in a way that seemed minor compared to whips or chains, yet which carried its own kind of sting. Pain here was not the goal so much as endurance, the expectation that one must remain still, head bowed, no matter how long the hours stretched, while the eyes of neighbors measured one's ability to submit. At times, punishments were designed, not only for the wrongdoer, but also for the lesson they provided to onlookers. In villages, where theft of grain or firewood threatened survival, an offender might be made to carry the very object of their transgression through the settlement. A man who had stolen rice might be forced to walk with sacks tied to his back, their weight heavier than the crime itself. Someone who had cut wood illegally might parade with logs strapped awkwardly across their shoulders. Such images lingered in the minds of children who watched wide-eyed as lessons were played out in full view, shaping their understanding of what it meant to transgress. Sometimes, the punishment took on a theatrical quality, using objects not for pain, but for ridicule. There were records of villagers being made to wear mock hats or signs that labeled their offense in large characters. A liar might carry a placard that read "One who speaks falsehoods," while a man guilty of laziness could be adorned with a comically oversized broom tied to his waist, a silent command that he should sweep the dust from his own habits. These gestures may seem almost humorous to us, yet in the small, watchful world of a village, such ridicule bit deeply into one's sense of dignity. The staging of punishment was deliberate. At crossroads, where pathways from fields, wells, and workshops converged, the condemned might be stationed for a day or two, ensuring that all who passed witnessed their shame. Farmers leading oxen, children walking to fetch water, elders, on their way to the shrine, all would encounter the figure of discipline, standing as a caution carved into everyday life. The very placement of the punishment in these transitional spaces turned ordinary movement into participation. Each passerby became part of the silent audience, reinforcing the lesson without a word. These methods, while varied, shared a common thread. They did not isolate the offender, but wove punishment directly into the fabric of the village. The rhythms of agriculture, trade, and ritual carried on, but always with the subtle reminder that order rested on visibility, on the collective witness of the community. A punishment unseen was a punishment wasted, and so, the village square, the temple steps, the market stalls, and even the humble roadside became not only spaces of labor and exchange, but also stages upon which discipline unfolded. Each act of correction was both personal and to reform the wrongdoer, while reminding all others that their lives, too, were bound by the delicate threads of custom and law. In certain valleys of the southern provinces, where rice paddies stretched in orderly lines and the rhythm of the seasons dictated every activity, punishments carried a distinctly agricultural character. Villagers here often saw no sense in wasting resources or energy on methods that did not somehow tie back into daily life. Thus, when a petty thief was caught snatching handfuls of grain or secretly cutting stalks of bamboo to sell in neighboring markets, the punishment was not always physical pain, but rather the burden of extra, menial, and highly visible labor. One such penalty was known, in local speech, as the pestle duty. A man convicted of pilfering from communal storage would be assigned to stand at the great village mortar, a massive stone basin in which rice was pounded into flour. For days at a time, he was required to wield the heavy wooden pestle, lifting and striking in endless rhythm. The task was exhausting, for the weight of the pestle was considerable, and the dust from the pounding would cling to skin and clothing, creating an image of shame. Villagers passing by would see him sweating, shoulders slumped, his punishment on display as much as the pounding itself. In some records, elders noted that such men often emerged with aching arms, but also with a sharper appreciation of the labor required to transform rice into food, a moral lesson achieved through monotony rather than lashes. In northern regions, where winters were harsh and survival often hinged on shared responsibility, the punishments turned colder, both literally and figuratively. Those who neglected communal duties, such as failing to maintain irrigation ditches or ignoring the watchtower during their assigned hours, might be subjected to what was called the chill of recklessness. During a particularly cold evening, the culprit was forced to stand outside the village gates, holding a wooden tablet that named his offense. Wrapped only in thin garments, he endured the cold night, while the rest of the villagers warmed themselves by their hearths. Yet, even here, the punishment carried a communal spirit. Someone, usually a relative or sympathetic neighbor, would quietly bring a blanket or hot tea, demonstrating the balance of censure and compassion that underpinned rural justice. The punishment was not meant to destroy, but to humble, to remind the individual of his responsibilities while reaffirming the bonds of village kinship. In contrast, certain river communities had devised punishments that made use of the waterways themselves. Minor offenders, those who broke small trading agreements or disrupted fishing rights, might be required to balance on narrow rafts, set adrift in the shallows, under watchful eyes from the banks. These raft standers, as they were called, were not in real danger of drowning, for the rafts were tied to posts with ropes. Yet the act was humiliating, as onlookers laughed and pointed at the sight of a grown man swaying clumsily, struggling to maintain his balance as passing waves or mischievous children, splashing nearby, threatened to send him tumbling into the muddy river. By the time he was released, soaked from repeated falls, the offender carried both the sting of embarrassment and a renewed understanding of his place in the social fabric. Perhaps most curious were the punishments reserved for gossip and slander, offenses that could tear at the delicate web of harmony upon which villages relied. In some districts, a talkative offender was made to wear a long wooden collar with small bells attached, so that every step announced his presence. Wherever he walked, people would hear the jingling and recall his loose tongue. Children would sometimes chase behind, ringing their own bells mockingly, turning his walk into a procession of ridicule. In other places, gossipers were compelled to carry water from the well to every household, a symbol of turning their restless tongues into useful service. Both methods sought not to brutalize, but to reform, to transform idle speech into a burden, and then into action. Travelers from neighboring villages, passing through, often remarked on the ingenuity of these punishments, while they lacked the fearsome spectacle of imperial justice. They revealed something of the character of rural governance, the preference for balance, for visible but temporary shame, for lessons that tied back into the daily rhythms of survival. For in truth, villagers could not afford to lose members to prison or exile. Every pair of hands was needed in the fields, at the kilns, or along the rivers. Thus, punishments had to serve a double purpose: to correct the offender while keeping him tied to the community that depended on him. And so, across fields and mountains, rivers and alleys, the peculiar punishments of medieval Chinese villages reflected a world where justice was both stern and practical, where shame was wielded more often than violence, and where the memory of standing in the cold or pounding rice under watchful eyes could linger longer than any lash upon the back. As we move deeper into the subtler layers of medieval village life, it becomes clear that punishments in rural China were never simple acts of retribution. They were bound into a larger rhythm of order, morality, and symbolism that extended far beyond the single individual who was being disciplined. Every act of censure carried with it echoes of the collective past, hints of Confucian teachings, and reminders of a world in which honor and shame could be as decisive as chains and whips. One such device of control was the practice of standing punishments. In villages, offenders might be made to stand motionless for hours at a time in front of the ancestral shrine, often while balancing a heavy wooden board across their shoulders. This board, sometimes a narrow plank, and at other times a cumbersome crosspiece, would grow heavier with each passing moment, pressing down on the body until the arms trembled. Yet what mattered most was not the physical strain, was the gaze of the community. Farmers, elders, and children passing by the shrine would see the figure bowed under the weight of wood and shame, and in their minds, this would serve as a warning. Such displays reaffirmed the idea that disobedience was not a private affair, but a fracture in the wider fabric of harmony. More curious still was the occasional use of silence itself as punishment. In some communities, individuals who disrupted harmony through gossip or quarrels were required to take what might be called an enforced vow of silence. For several days, sometimes stretching into weeks, the offender would not be permitted to speak publicly. If they wished to communicate, it had to be through gestures, written characters scratched on slips of paper, or the assistance of others. The punishment did not bruise the body, but it struck at the heart of participation in the village, removing the person from the flow of stories, exchanges, and social warmth that made life bearable. The quiet could feel heavier than chains, and those who endured it would later remark on how deeply isolating it felt. Then there were punishments tied to the cycle of agriculture itself. In certain villages, wrongdoers might be ordered to weed rice paddies barefoot under the hot summer sun, or to haul stones for the repair of irrigation ditches. These tasks were often deliberately chosen for their unpleasantness: mosquito-filled water, biting mud, or the chafing of ropes against shoulders. Yet they also bore a curious double meaning. While meant as hardship, they simultaneously contributed to the community's survival. A thief condemned 2 hours of back-breaking labor at the water channels might well have been cursing his fate. But at the same time, the village's harvest depended on the very work his punishment produced. In this sense, justice was not merely punitive, was also productive. A particularly unusual punishment described in some regional records involved the temporary confiscation of footwear. Shoes, simple as they may seem, were highly significant possessions in the daily life of medieval peasants. To be deprived of them meant enduring long days of work with bare feet on rough ground, enduring stones, thorns, and mud. Villagers who were punished this way would be marked by the visible discomfort of their steps, and their silent suffering became a form of spectacle. It was a reminder that even small comforts could be withheld when social norms were broken. Still, among the most striking punishments were those that blurred the line between mockery and moral instruction. Offenders might be made to wear exaggerated hats, masks, or placards declaring their misdeeds, parading through the village lanes as neighbors watched. A man guilty of drunken behavior could be adorned with a tall, awkward headpiece fashioned from reeds or bamboo, which would sway comically as he walked, drawing laughter from children and disapproval from adults. The message was sharp. Laughter could wound just as effectively as the lash, and humiliation often left deeper imprints than pain. Yet, while these punishments may sound harsh, it is important to remember the broader context. Medieval villages were tight-knit worlds. Everyone's labor contributed to survival, and resources were scarce. To expel someone permanently from the community was often unthinkably deprived the group of working hands and placed the exile in grave danger. For that reason, punishments leaned more toward correction than destruction, toward reintegration rather than permanent exclusion. Once a debt to society was considered paid, the offender would usually be welcomed back, though perhaps with lingering whispers or careful watchfulness. This focus on restoration explains why many punishments carried with them an air of ritual. The conclusion of a penalty might involve offerings at the ancestral shrine, bowing before elders, or the sharing of food with neighbors as a sign of renewed harmony. The punishment, then, was not a solitary endpoint. It was part of a larger journey that ended in reconciliation. As we reflect on these varied practices, some severe, some symbolic, some bordering on the strange, we begin to glimpse the layered texture of justice in rural Chinese life. It was not uniform, nor was it free from cruelty, but it carried within it an enduring concern for balance, for the weaving back together of frayed ties. And yet, this picture is only half complete. For while we have looked closely at the punishments themselves, the deeper question remains: how did villagers interpret these acts? What did shame, silence, or labor truly mean to those who lived them day by day? To answer this, we must turn next to the voices of daily life, the proverbs, stories, and oral traditions that framed these punishments not merely as laws, but as moral lessons carried through generations. As the villages grew into small but organized clusters of households, the fabric of communal life became increasingly defined by a set of subtle rules and quiet expectations. These expectations were not always written down on bamboo slips or proclaimed by wandering officials. Instead, they were carried forward through hushed conversations between grandparents and grandchildren, or in the lessons mothers gave their children while cooking rice, or in the tone of a village elder's voice when settling a dispute over irrigation channels. In this way, order did not rely solely on state edicts, but on a deeply localized system of habit, memory, and shared belief. Yet even within this quiet, lived law, punishments peculiar in their design were sometimes the tools used to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable conduct. One of the more curious practices was the punishment of silent exclusion. This was not a beating or a confinement, but rather the deliberate withdrawal of speech from the offender. In certain villages, a person found guilty of dishonoring a ritual, or failing to fulfill communal obligations, could be made the subject of a silent pact. For several days, sometimes stretching into weeks, no one would address the individual by name, greet them, or acknowledge their presence. They would be served food without words, passed in the street without eye contact, and left to wander through daily life as if wrapped in an invisible shroud. Such punishments carried no physical harm, yet the weight of isolation in a community so tightly interwoven could be unbearable. Many accounts suggest that even hardened offenders would beg for forgiveness long before the silence lifted, finding the absence of human acknowledgement a heavier burden than the sting of any cane. There were also practices that revealed a deep intertwining of punishment with the rhythm of agricultural work. Villages reliant on rice cultivation often tied penalties to the very fields that sustained life. An offender might be sentenced to mud duty, where they were required to work ankle-deep in flooded paddies, at awkward hours sometimes in the chill of dawn before others stirred, or at midday when the sun pressed heavily upon the water's surface. This punishment was less about cruelty and more about inconvenience, designed to exhaust the body while also reminding the culprit of their reliance on communal labor. The work was often overseen by younger villagers, creating the curious inversion where youth temporarily held authority over their elders. Such spectacles, though quiet, carried symbolic weight. Misdeeds placed one lower in the social order, even beneath the authority of the inexperienced. Other penalties carried a strangely theatrical quality. One village record tells of the donkey walk, in which a guilty party was required to ride backward on a donkey through the village lanes while children followed, singing mocking rhymes. The punishment did not inflict pain, but it left a mark of shame that lingered far beyond the short journey. To ride backward was to invert the natural order of things, to declare before all eyes that one's behavior had been upside down. The laughter of children innocent, yet merciless, ensured that the memory would haunt the wrongdoer for months, or even years. In societies where honor and reputation were more precious than wealth, such ridicule was a powerful deterrent. Even the architecture of villages sometimes reflected the peculiar punishments woven into daily life. At the edge of certain hamlets, there stood wooden platforms or narrow benches, not used for rest but for display. A wrongdoer might be seated upon these structures during market days, required to sit for hours under the gaze of passers-by. Occasionally, a placard was hung around their neck, bearing a crude drawing or a few mocking characters that summarized their offense: liar, idler, or greedy. Unlike the grand pillories of cities, these village platforms were planks, shaded by nothing but the open sky. Yet the very ordinariness of the setting made the punishment sting all the more, for the wrongdoer was shamed in the full sight of those whose respect mattered most, their neighbors, kin, and friends. And then there were penalties that blurred the line between punishment and ritual. In some villages, an offender might be required to stand before the ancestral shrine and bow not once, but dozens upon dozens of times, until the knees ached and the back grew stiff. This was known as the bow of contrition. The act combined physical endurance with spiritual humility, forcing the individual to symbolically lower themselves before the spirits of their forebears. Some accounts even suggest that the number of bows was calculated to match the perceived weight of the offense. Minor missteps might require 30 bows, while graver ones could demand 100 or more. Villagers often gathered to witness, standing in respectful silence as the offender's repeated motions filled the air. With the soft creak of knees and the faint thud of palms against the shrine floor. What is remarkable in all these peculiar customs is how they reveal the deep humanity of village justice. Its reliance not on cruelty or destruction, but on reminders, symbols, and gestures that struck at the offender's pride, dignity, and sense of belonging. In a world where survival itself depended on unity, the worst punishment was not the loss of coin or the pain of lashes, but the loss of standing within the small circle of one's peers. Every penalty, however peculiar, was designed to restore the fragile balance of communal harmony rather than to sever it. As we observe these customs from a great distance in time, one can almost picture the scenes: a donkey plodding awkwardly down a narrow lane, a farmer wading alone through muddy paddies at sunrise, a villager bowing again and again before the smoke-stained shrine, while neighbors look on. These were not merely punishments, they were lessons, woven into the living fabric of daily life. And as Section 2 unfolds further, it is within these quiet acts of correction that the philosophy of rural justice begins to reveal itself, showing us that the path to order was paved not only by law, but by shared memory, ritual, and the slow weight of tradition. Life in medieval Chinese villages was shaped not only by work and tradition, but also by the invisible lines of moral order that punishments were designed to reinforce. And while some punishments were physical or humiliating in nature, others leaned heavily on psychological weight, an element often underestimated by outsiders. To live under the constant possibility of being made into a spectacle for one's neighbors was, in itself, a form of discipline that went beyond any single day's penalty. One striking example was the practice of obligatory public apologies, which might seem tame compared to whips or stocks, yet in a tightly knit society, it carried tremendous sting. A villager accused of slander, theft of grain, or even neglecting to fulfill communal duties could be marched to the square and required to kneel, bow, and recite memorized words of repentance before elders, peers, and curious children alike. Unlike harsher punishments, this method did not scar the body, but instead etched deep grooves of shame and memory. Elders sometimes insisted that apologies be repeated on 3 consecutive days to fix humility firmly in the heart. The ritual often ended with neighbors murmuring in agreement, or, in more mischievous cases, whispering additional rumors to prolong the embarrassment. Alongside these moralistic approaches, there were punishments designed with peculiar creativity, such as burden punishments, in which offenders were forced to carry heavy symbolic objects through the village. A dishonest miller might be strapped with an oversized wooden model of a grinding stone and made to shuffle through the lanes as children pointed and laughed. A farmer who neglected irrigation duties could be given a leaky wooden bucket filled with water to balance on his back, the constant dripping marking his shame with every step. The objects themselves were not dangerous, but the weight combined with the long, slow march made the ordeal exhausting. Neighbors observing this spectacle would be reminded not only of the culprit's fault, but of the moral principle it represented. Then there were punishments tied directly to the natural environment. Some records describe villagers compelled to spend hours or even days standing in ponds or rivers, watched by guards or neighbors, until their limbs were stiff from cold and their patience was worn thin. This was not considered a form of torture, at least in the local perception, but rather a way of cooling a hot temper or washing away greed. Villagers who argued violently or disobeyed elders could be sentenced to stand knee-deep in water, shivering as ducks paddled past and curious onlookers offered commentary from the banks. When they were finally released, they were expected to emerge, both physically cleansed and morally purified. Other punishments blurred the line between justice and comedy. In some villages, Offenders were compelled to wear animal masks or costumes during daily chores. A gossip might be given a crude wooden mask shaped like a donkey's head to suggest stubbornness or foolish braying. Someone caught stealing vegetables could be forced to wear a chicken mask carrying a basket of turnips, or leeks for others to take freely. This blend of satire and discipline transformed wrongdoing into theater, ensuring that the lesson lingered long after the mask was removed. It also reinforced the role of humor in communal justice. Punishments that made people laugh were often remembered, longer than those that merely inflicted pain. Equally curious were rotating duty punishments, where a villager found guilty of laziness or negligence might be ordered to perform tedious public tasks at odd hours. One man might be tasked with ringing the village bell every hour through the night, while another could be made to sweep the market square each morning before others awoke. These tasks were not physically brutal, but they disturbed sleep, altered routine, and served as constant reminders of failure. Sometimes, punishments were extended for weeks, making the offender's name synonymous with fatigue and drudgery. The lesson was simple. Idleness in a society that relied on collective labor would not be tolerated. Still, underlying these punishments was a thread of ritual and symbolism. Chinese rural culture valued harmony and balance, so penalties often mirrored the perceived imbalance caused by a crime. If someone took too much from the community granary, they were tasked with replenishing it twofold. If a villager spoke too harshly, their punishment might involve silence, being forbidden to speak for several days, forced to rely on hand gestures or notes to communicate. This silent period became a living metaphor, teaching restraint in speech, through literal deprivation of it. Even the smallest infractions were often dealt with through inventive consequences. Children who misbehaved, especially those who lied, could be made to kneel on dried peas or kernels of corn, a mild but memorable discomfort that was thought to press honesty into the body through aching knees. Teenagers who shirked chores might be ordered to pound laundry by the riverside under supervision, repeating the monotonous task until their arms grew weary. These punishments may seem peculiar or even whimsical today, but in their context, they were seen as practical methods of reinforcing discipline while avoiding the need for constant surveillance. Through all of this, what stands out most is not cruelty, but the sheer variety of approaches. Punishments in these villages were often designed less to harm than to remind, less to isolate than to fold offenders back into the rhythms of community life. They were public, symbolic, and communal in a way that reflected how villages understood justice itself, not as the enforcement of distant laws, but as the maintenance of delicate harmony in small, crowded worlds. As the centuries stretched onward, and dynasties rose and fell, the peculiar punishments of Chinese village life took on a rhythm of their own, sometimes harsh, sometimes oddly humorous, and always deeply woven into the social fabric of the community. Many of these punishments were not designed to cripple or permanently damage the offender, but to remind them of their place within the carefully balanced hierarchy of the village. One such example was the practice of the kneeling stone. A heavy rounded stone was placed in the open square, often in front of the temple or ancestral shrine. Offenders, who may have committed an act as minor as speaking rudely to an elder or neglecting a small duty, would be required to kneel upon this stone for an extended period of time. The act itself was not overtly violent, carried no lash marks or wounds, but the prolonged discomfort was both physically tiring and socially humiliating. Villagers would walk past on their way to the market or the fields, each glance serving as a reminder that honor was earned not through loud protest, but through humility and endurance. Another curious punishment revolved around the carrying of symbolic weights. Rather than being fined or imprisoned, offenders were sometimes required to carry large, awkward objects through the village lanes. A man who gossiped too freely might be made to carry a heavy wooden tablet inscribed with the words, "Loose tongue." A woman who neglected her duties at the communal well might be forced to haul a cumbersome bucket, not filled with water, but with stones. The point was not cruelty. It was a theatrical reminder of the offense. Children would watch, elders would nod in approval, and the entire spectacle reinforced the moral code without spilling blood. What makes these punishments so remarkable is their almost ritualized theatricality. They were not simply corrections, they were performances, carefully designed to be remembered. When one villager endured his turn beneath the public gaze, others absorbed the lesson without needing to endure it themselves. Shame, after all, was as powerful as any rod or chain. It is also telling that many punishments ended not with lasting exile, but with reconciliation, after the period of shame or discomfort was endured. The offender would often bring a small offering, perhaps incense, at the shrine, perhaps a meal shared with the elders to symbolize their return to the fold. In this way, punishment was less about casting someone out, and more about, gently, sometimes awkwardly, ushering them back in. The records also mention certain punishments linked to festive occasions, which may strike modern ears as especially strange. For instance, during the New Year's season in some villages, an offender might be costumed in brightly colored rags and made to dance clumsily in the marketplace, to the laughter of children. While the humiliation was sharp in the moment, the festive air softened its sting, and by the time lanterns were lit in the evening, the entire village had moved on from judgment to celebration. Punishment, in such cases, became almost indistinguishable from theater or carnival. Yet not all measures were so light. In certain regions, the ancient concept of the kanga, large wooden collar fitted around the neck still, lingered in rural practice. This device, while uncomfortable, was not usually paired with violence. Instead, it immobilized the offender and placed them in view of all who passed. Some wore it for a single day, others for several, depending on the gravity of their mistake. Villagers might offer food or water to the one encumbered, an act that at once demonstrated compassion and reinforced the lesson of humility. Though heavy, the kang was symbolic. It showed that while one could still live within the community, freedom of movement and freedom from shame had to be earned back. Through all of this, one sees not merely cruelty, but a striking practicality. Imprisonment would have been costly, drawing a laborer away from the fields or workshops, weakening the productivity of the entire village. Corporal punishment might leave someone unable to work, again draining the community of its strength. But a punishment that stung pride while leaving the body capable that was far more useful. It was a system born not from abstract law, but from the everyday necessities of agrarian life. The peculiar punishments of these medieval Chinese villages thus illuminate not only the moral codes of the time, but also the balance of survival. Every family, every hand, every back bent in labor was needed. Justice had to bend toward practicality, even if it wore the costume of shame or absurdity. In that balance between correction and compassion, between humiliation and reintegration, we glimpse something deeply human. And as the centuries wore on, these practices, though sometimes softened, never entirely disappeared. They lingered in oral traditions, in village records, and even in the memory of children who would later tell the tale of the kneeling stone, or the gossip's tablet, as if they were stories half frightening and half amusing. Each punishment became not only a moment of discipline but also a fragment of folklore woven into the vast, enduring tapestry of Chinese rural life. The rhythms of village life often made the punishments themselves more visible than one might expect. Unlike the great imperial cities where a wrongdoer could vanish into a prison compound, in the countryside the censure was public, open, and deeply tied to the agricultural clock. When peasants sowed rice, tended their silkworms, or drew water from communal wells, they could hardly avoid passing the open square or wooden posts where minor offenders were displayed. This exposure was intentional. Shame was never private. The mere sight of a bound figure, perhaps strapped into a crude frame or seated on the hard Earth Under Guard served as a living reminder of what happened to those who transgressed. Because of this, many punishments in rural China blurred the line between penalty and spectacle. There were no grand theaters, but the human drama of discipline filled that void. For example, petty thieves were sometimes required to wear placards around their necks declaring their crime. The characters painted in thick black strokes on boards so heavy they bent the offender's shoulders forward. Children, curious and unafraid, would tug at each other's sleeves to read the words aloud, often giggling, while their elders nodded gravely. The shame was doubled not only in the burden carried, but also in the way it transformed the guilty into a lesson, an object of gossip and entertainment in equal measure. In some villages, storytellers later borrowed these scenes when recounting local scandals. A punishment could live on in memory long after the physical discomfort had ended, retold beside fires or during festivals, binding the story of the culprit to the collective memory of the community. Oral tradition magnified the power of shame, since every repeat performance of the tale kept the humiliation alive, long after crops had been harvested or the seasons had changed. It is also worth remembering that punishments reflected the communal structure of these villages. Rural justice was rarely just the matter of an individual against the state. It was about maintaining harmony among neighbors who worked side by side, who needed to trust one another in planting, irrigation, and harvesting. A disruptive villager did not simply inconvenience a magistrate, he threatened the flow of water through channels, the lending of animals, the rotation of fields. Thus, punishments were not abstract decrees. They were highly practical measures meant to preserve the delicate web of mutual reliance. One curious aspect of these punishments was their often symbolic nature. A farmer who failed to contribute his share of labor to irrigation projects might be forced to carry buckets of water back and forth in the square under watchful eyes, not because the water itself mattered, but because it dramatized his failure and corrected it through a performance. Similarly, a merchant who tried to cheat customers with faulty weights might be ordered to sit beside an oversized balance scale, mocked by villagers as they compared his false weights with honest stones pulled from the fields. These punishments were rarely bloody or final. Instead, they were theatrical, embedding moral lessons within daily routine. Of course, harsher measures existed. Villages could not entirely ignore the reach of imperial law, and when crimes escalated serious theft, violence, the punishments grew more severe, sometimes involving whipping, forced labor, or even delivery to regional officials for trial. Yet the more peculiar punishments, the ones that lingered in memory, were not necessarily the cruelest, but those that were inventive. They struck at pride and dignity rather than flesh, reminding each person that the approval of one's neighbors was as necessary as bread or rice. Such creativity in local justice may seem strange now, but it reflected a world in which people lived closely entwined, where reputations stretched farther than written records. In the imperial archives of dynasties, one might find lists of laws and punishments, but in the village lanes, justice was lived, seen, and whispered about. A punishment was effective not because it was written in a code, but because it was enacted in the open air, visible to children, elders, and passers-by alike. It is within this fabric of daily life and social order that we begin to notice how punishments in medieval Chinese villages, though peculiar, were never random. They arose from an instinctive understanding of community discipline, binding individuals more tightly into the collective rhythm of farming seasons, ancestral worship, and local festivals. They shaped behavior not by brute terror, but by the subtle yet enduring power of shame, memory, and social spectacle. And it is here, in these living theaters of rural justice, that our exploration of peculiar punishments begins to deepen. For what we have glimpsed so far is only the surface. Beneath it lie stranger customs, inventive corrections, and punishments whose symbolism reveals as much about the values of the time as it does about the offenses themselves. Though punishments in the village square often seemed like matters of immediate discipline, keeping children obedient, apprentices honest, or farmers punctual, they were never entirely separate from the greater philosophies that shaped the empire. A village elder might scold a boy for shirking his work, but behind his words lay echoes of Confucian maxims about the duties of sons toward fathers, students toward teachers, and subjects toward rulers. Even the carpenter's apprentice, who accepted a public beating with stoic silence, was unknowingly acting out a lesson that scholars in the capital would have recognized, that endurance in the face of correction was the first step toward cultivating virtue. Likewise, the weight of a wooden cane upon a thief's shoulders was not simply a tool of shame, but a symbol of cosmic balance. For many in the countryside, it was said that disorder in the village could ripple outward to disturb the harmony of heaven and earth. A quarrel between neighbors might be small, but left unchecked, it could upset the order of family, clan, and community, and imbalance that Confucian scholars warned could weaken the entire state. Thus, the punishment of one man in a dusty square was imagined as a contribution to the stability of all under heaven. Taoist whispers, too, could be heard beneath the rhythms of local justice. Some villagers muttered that harsh beatings disturbed the natural flow of life, and that gentle correction was more in keeping with the Tao. A few wandering mendicants, passing through the hamlets, preached that too much punishment invited misfortune, for it jarred the natural harmony between man and earth. These ideas were seldom embraced by magistrates, yet they lingered like soft breezes in the corners of village talk, offering an alternative voice against cruelty. Yet the most enduring current that flowed beneath every punishment, whether a child scolded in a home, a laborer fined in the market, or a thief paraded with wooden boards around his neck, was the current of Confucian order, an order that saw discipline not as cruelty, but as a form of care. To correct was to guide. To punish was to restore the balance between duty and responsibility. In this way, punishments became not merely practical, but moral, carrying with them the full weight of centuries of thought. And so, as the rhythms of village life continued, each punishment given or received carried meaning beyond its immediate sting. It was not only a moment of discipline, but a small act within a vast design in empire's attempt to align the behavior of its people with the great principles of harmony, duty, and balance. It is here, then, that we must pause and lift our eyes beyond the narrow village square, beyond the bamboo rods and wooden stocks, to ask, what philosophies truly lay behind these punishments? What ideals shaped the magistrates' judgments, and what visions of order guided emperors in their courts? With this widening lens, we now step into Section 3, a journey into the deeper philosophies Confucian, Taoist legalist that gave shape to China's punishments, transforming them from acts of necessity into reflections of a grander moral universe. As we drift further into Section 3, the landscape of medieval Chinese villages reveals even more about how punishment was not only a tool of law, but also a subtle performance of culture. To the modern mind, it may seem strange that punishment was so often enacted in the very heart of daily life, in streets, markets, and temple courtyards, rather than in private or isolated spaces. Yet, in a village where privacy itself was scarce, discipline became another layer of the shared fabric of existence. The community gathered not only to watch dramas staged for festivals, but also to witness the small dramas of justice. Each minor transgression turned into a moment of instruction, shame, or deterrence. One can imagine the dusty square on a spring morning, where merchants arranged baskets of garlic and millet, and where farmers paused after leading oxen to the fields. Into this rhythm of life might step a local constable, escorting a villager accused of lying about grain weights at the market. The punishment, though mild compared to harsher penalties of the empire, might involve being made to kneel on sharp millet husks for several hours, hands bound behind the back. Villagers passing by would see the bowed figure, the flushed cheeks, and the small tremors of discomfort, and without a word, they would be reminded of the value of honesty in trade. Punishment here was not abstract justice, but a direct insertion into the tapestry of the day. The symbolism of materials mattered as much as the punishment itself. Sharp husks of millet, broken reeds, or stiff bamboo mats were not chosen by accident. They belonged to the environment of the villagers, everyday objects transformed into instruments of discipline. Just as Confucian teaching emphasized the moral order within ordinary life, so too did punishment borrow from the ordinary to reinforce the extraordinary authority of law. This was not merely cruelty, but a kind of symbolic alignment. If one disrupted the balance of the household or market, then the very tools of that household or market could be turned against them until harmony was restored. Travelers' records from the later dynasties suggest that these small village punishments were regarded with a mixture of dread and humor. The punishments were effective precisely because they carried no grandeur. They were not punishments of empire, not executions, not mutilations, not the horrors sometimes ordered in distant prefectural courts. Rather, they were the humble theater of discipline, reminding villagers that justice lived among them, not only above them. For example, a record from the Song dynasty describes villagers who laughed at the sight of a man forced to carry 2 heavy buckets of water endlessly around the market for misusing communal wells. The laughter was not cruel, but communal. Everyone shared the lesson, and everyone enjoyed the absurdity of the spectacle. As centuries passed, these practices adapted, blending local custom with official edict. Sometimes magistrates, traveling through villages, would note these punishments and incorporate them into legal codes, not because they were officially sanctioned, but because they seemed to work. Other times, the punishments existed in a gray area, never approved, never forbidden, simply tolerated as long as they upheld order and did not spill into excess. At the heart of Section 3 lies this notion that punishment in medieval Chinese villages was never merely about inflicting pain, but about communicating belonging. To be punished was to be reabsorbed into the collective order after a period of imbalance. The shame of public exposure, the sting of rough husks, the exhaustion of carrying water buckets, or the humiliation of standing with a placard that declared one's crime. All of these were designed not to push someone out forever, but to push them back into place. And so, as we let our minds wander through the narrow lanes, past clay-walled homes and temple bells that echoed at dawn, we begin to see how punishment and daily life were interwoven like threads in a single cloth. Just as weaving a mistake into a garment would be visible for all to see, so too did misconduct leave its mark, until, through ritualized discipline, it was corrected and the pattern made whole again. This, then, is where Section 3 continues to guide us, deeper into the philosophy of belonging, of collective order, and of the quiet yet enduring ways that medieval Chinese villages taught their people to live, not as individuals alone, but as members of a watchful and remembering community. As the decades slipped by, the very nature of punishment in these medieval Chinese villages seemed to evolve into something of a cultural ritual rather than an unthinking act of cruelty. Where one might expect to find nothing but fear or humiliation, the villagers began weaving an odd kind of pride into the manner by which punishments were administered. Elders often remarked that the way a village punished its offenders revealed more about its values than any lofty philosophy or official decree from the imperial courts. It was not the punishments themselves that defined order, but the stories that spread about them afterward, whispered in courtyards, recited by traveling merchants at roadside inns, and recalled by farmers while repairing tools at dusk. One such tale often spoken of concerned a punishment known as the weighing stool. In appearance, it was little more than a narrow plank balanced precariously on a stone, But in practice, it became a curious exercise in endurance and patience. The accused would be asked to sit upright upon the stool, while villagers placed small sacks of grain in their lap, one after the other, until the balance faltered. The symbolism was clear. Misdeeds weighed heavily on a community, and each added burden represented the strain imposed on others. The punishment ended not when the person toppled, but when they managed to maintain composure for as long as the elders deemed fitting. To falter too quickly was considered a mark of weakness. To endure in silence was seen as evidence that the lesson had been absorbed. Travelers who passed through such villages were often perplexed by these rituals. In one recorded account from a wandering scribe, he noted that while imperial punishments in larger towns relied on harsh displays of authority, whippings, stocks, and heavy fines, these smaller hamlets preferred punishments that drew in the whole community. Rarely was a punishment carried out in private. Instead, the villagers gathered, sometimes even turning the event into a festival of sorts. Children clutched their parents' sleeves, vendors sold warm dumplings and tea at the edges of the crowd, and young men leaned against wooden posts, smirking at the spectacle. There was a paradox here. Punishment was both solemn and strangely entertaining, meant to deter wrongdoing, but also to knit the community together in shared observation. Not all punishments were as measured or symbolic. However, some carried an almost theatrical flair. For example, in the fishing villages along riverbanks, a common punishment for deceitful traders was the mock catch. The accused would be tied loosely in a fishing net and left to dangle from a pole over shallow water. They were never dropped in, but the imagery was unmistakable. Those who tried to trick their neighbors were themselves caught like fish. Witnesses described the offenders swaying awkwardly in the breeze, their dignity unraveling with every gust of wind until they begged forgiveness. It was not the physical discomfort that shamed them most, but the laughter of onlookers, who sometimes made jokes about catching a fine carp or reeling in a crooked eel. The more one studies these peculiar methods, the clearer it becomes that they were rooted less in cruelty and more in symbolism. A punishment that embarrassed without maiming, that corrected without scarring, held a particular place in the psychology of these villages. It allowed life to resume the next day without permanent fractures. The man weighed down on the stool could still harvest his rice fields afterward. The merchant mocked in a net could still reopen his stall the following morning. The punishment ended, but the lesson lingered, and the story of it traveled further than the sting of a whip ever could. In some cases, villagers even took pride in being punished with creativity. Records tell of a young farmer who, after being subjected to a punishment involving carrying water jugs from one end of the village to the other for hours, later boasted that he had served his time more honorably than any who sat on the weighing stool. The sense of competition between punishments, as odd as it sounds, gave them a life beyond the original intent. To endure with stoicism became a badge of strength. To crack under pressure, on the other hand, brought whispers and mockery that lingered long after the punishment had passed. This emphasis on endurance, symbolism, and public spectacle marked a distinct shift in how we must understand medieval village justice. It was not simply about the accused, it was about reinforcing collective memory and moral teaching. Each punishment became a miniature story, passed down with details exaggerated or reshaped to fit the needs of the listener. Over time, these stories merged with local folklore, blurring the line between history and legend. To a child listening by the firelight, there was little distinction between the tale of a punished thief and the story of a wandering spirit who guarded the rice paddies. Both existed to remind the young of the boundaries of behavior, of the unseen consequences of straying too far. And so, as we move further into the peculiar punishments that defined the daily order of medieval Chinese villages, it becomes clear that we are not merely looking at crude justice. We are looking at a social language, one spoken not through words but through acts, symbols, and the endurance of those who bore them. These punishments were at once practical, performative, and deeply woven into the culture of the time. They set the stage for the more complex and sometimes astonishingly creative practices that we shall now examine as this exploration of Section 3 deepens further. As the 18th century pressed further into its second half, one began to notice subtle but steady changes in how people organized their evenings, especially in towns and growing provincial centers. The flicker of the fire, the simple bed warmer, and the heavy wool quilt still dominated the imagery of nighttime, but new voices, philosophers, doctors, and clergymen were beginning to weigh in on what constituted proper rest. Sleep, once left to the natural rhythm of day and night, increasingly became the subject of quiet instruction, written advice, and printed pamphlets. Many of these tracts emphasized moderation, neither too much nor too little, neither too hot nor too cold. A bed that was poorly aired, they warned, was a trap for illness, while one overheated by coals might risk dangerous vapors. Thus, in the middle of the century, households of middling means found themselves balancing the practical wisdom of their grandmothers with the polished prescriptions of learned men. One might imagine the contrast clearly. In a low-beamed farmhouse kitchen, a grandmother stirring the embers at dusk still insisted on tucking a brick wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed. Meanwhile, in a townhouse a few miles away, a young couple, newly literate and eager to show their refinement, pored over a printed guide advising them to rise at dawn and to avoid the indolent heaviness of long slumber. What is remarkable is not the divergence itself, but the coexistence. Both methods, the inherited and the modern, were present in the same century, sometimes even under the same roof. Servants in large households might continue with the older practice of warming their palates with a pan of coals, while their employers experimented with newly recommended feather mattresses and regulated sleeping hours. Seasonal rhythms also pressed heavily upon the habits of the time. In summer, when days stretched long, household members might delay bedtime to enjoy the faint light and lingering warmth, venturing out into gardens or sitting by open doors for fresh air. Winter, by contrast, invited an earlier retreat, not only for comfort, but also for economy. Fewer candles would be consumed if the household gathered in bed sooner. And here again, devices like the bed warmer played an outsized role. A bed heated in January felt less like a luxury than a necessity, and its absence could mean long minutes, sometimes an hour of shivering before warmth returned. It is telling that in many households, the responsibility for heating the bed was entrusted to a specific person, often the youngest servant, or, in families without staff, one of the elder children. The ritual itself became a kind of punctuation mark at the end of the day, a signal that the household was finally ready to surrender to the night. Alongside these rhythms of warmth and darkness, there was also the question of noise or its absence. While today we might associate sleep with silence, in the 18th century night was far from quiet. Dogs barked, cocks crowed, watchmen called out the hours, and in cities, the rattling of carts or the voices of late wanderers echoed through narrow streets. Against this backdrop, the interior of the bedchamber acquired an even greater importance as a shield from the world outside. Heavy curtains, thick walls, and the careful placing of beds away from windows all contributed to an attempt to carve out a private pocket of calm. For the rural poor, such measures were impossible, yet even there, improvised methods, stuffing cracks with cloth or placing straw mats against drafty doors, represented small acts of agency in the pursuit of rest. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how slowly these practices evolved. While today, we often imagine innovation as rapid, in the 18th century change crept forward with measured steps. The introduction of printed advice did not sweep away older customs overnight. Rather, it layered them with new possibilities. A family might cling to their brick warmers for decades, even while purchasing a pamphlet that promised improved sleep through fresh air and regular rising. Such coexistence of the old and new created a tapestry of sleep culture that was uneven, richly varied, and always negotiated in the space between tradition and experiment. And so, by the closing years of the century, households across Europe and its colonies found themselves in a curious position. The bedchamber had not yet become the thoroughly private, sealed-off space it would later be in the Victorian era, but neither was it the wholly communal, open corner of life it had once been. Instead, it hovered between the two, half ritual, half experiment, balancing warmth with economy, custom with advice, comfort with moral discipline. It is within this liminal space, hovering between old medieval rhythms and the newer impulses of Enlightenment rationality, that the story of sleep in the 18th century unfolds most clearly. As the 18th century pressed forward, innovations in sleep and nightly comfort were no longer just curiosities of local households. They were becoming markers of progress and refinement. The very idea of sleep itself was undergoing a subtle but profound transformation. Whereas earlier generations had approached the night with a sense of stoic acceptance, wrapping themselves in whatever furs, cloaks, or homespun blankets they could muster, the new century carried with it an air of deliberate improvement. Sleep was no longer viewed solely as an inevitability of the human body. It was slowly being treated as a craft, an experience to be enhanced and, in some ways, perfected. Among the most telling signs of this shift was the growing interest in textiles, not just for clothing, but specifically for bedding. Town markets in England, France, and the German states began to feature bolts of softer linens and heavier quilts that were designed with the night in mind. Artisans experimented with dyes that resisted fading through repeated washes, creating sheets that carried faint tones of blue or pale green colors, believed to calm the mind. Some wealthier households even imported cotton from distant colonies, marveling at its softness compared to coarse European flax. While bed warmers kept the chill at bay, it was these fabrics that cradled the body, turning sleep into something warmer, softer, and decidedly more intentional. In certain towns, discussions of sleep began to surface in pamphlets and almanacs, alongside remedies for fevers and advice on crop planting. Writers encouraged readers to consider not just the food they ate or the air they breathed, but also the conditions under which they slept. A steady circulation of such advice gave rise to small but influential movements, some advocating for cleaner bedding and better ventilation, others warning against the dangers of too much warmth, claiming that overheated beds could lead to fainting spells or sluggishness come morning. These ideas circulated quietly, never quite stirring the masses, but planting seeds of awareness about how one ought to care for the hours spent in rest. Meanwhile, rural communities adapted in their own ways. For farmers, whose days began before sunrise, winter nights were long stretches of necessary recovery. Villagers in colder regions crafted elaborate feather beds, layering goose down until the mattress itself seemed to swallow the sleeper in a soft cocoon. In some Scandinavian households, it was not uncommon to see entire families sleeping together beneath one massive coverlet, the shared warmth reducing the need for constant tending of the hearth. By contrast, in southern Europe, where winters were less severe but dampness could creep into stone cottages, straw-stuffed mattresses were favored for their ability to be refreshed and replaced with relative ease, keeping pests and mold at bay. Perhaps most fascinating was how these practices gave rise to new rituals at the edge of night. A warm drink before bed, mold, cider, herbal tisane, or warm milk became customary in many regions, not only for soothing the body, but also for setting the mind at ease. The choice of herbs added to these drinks was often rooted in local belief: chamomile to quiet the nerves, lavender to invite dreams, valerian to ward off nightmares. What had once been the work of folk healers was now entering the domestic sphere, folded neatly into the nightly rhythm of family life. Candles, too, played a role in this evolving culture of sleep. Beeswax candles, prized for their clean and steady burn, were increasingly found in middle-class homes, replacing smoky tallow lamps. Their gentle, golden glow created an atmosphere more suited to winding down at the end of the day. The act of extinguishing a candle before bed became almost symbolic, a small ritual of surrendering to the night. In towns with stricter curfews, or watchmen who rang out the passing hours, families often tied their routines to the ringing of bells or the call of the night watch, merging communal rhythms with personal rest. As we move further into this century, what becomes clear is the slow but undeniable layering of intention upon sleep. Each addition, the warmed bedpan, the feather mattress, the quilt, the evening herb drink, the soft candlelight, was a modest improvement on its own, yet, together, they signaled a broader cultural turning point, the recognition that sleep was not a passive necessity, but a state worthy of preparation and care. And still, this evolution was far from finished. With each passing decade, new questions arose. Could sleep be made more efficient? Could the mind be trained to dream more peacefully? Could one awaken with greater vigor, if only the right conditions were met? These quiet inquiries, whispered around hearths and debated in pamphlets, were setting the stage for the next phase of nocturnal innovation, where the line between tradition and experiment blurred, and where the very definition of a good night's rest would continue to expand in unexpected ways. And so, as the story settles, the echoes of distant lives soften into silence. The little details, the weight of a wooden beam, the glimmer of a lantern's light, the faint creak of a floorboard, become no more than gentle impressions, dissolving like ripples on still water. The past drifts away, not with haste, but with a slow and graceful ease, as though time itself is content to rest. The people who once filled these moments recede gently, their footsteps fading into the hush of centuries, until only quiet remains. Around you, the night deepens. The air feels cooler, steadier. A soft breeze brushes against old shutters, carrying the scent of earth and the hush of trees at rest. The world outside has grown still, wrapped in a calm so deep it seems endless. You might imagine a single candle glowing faintly on a wooden table. Its flame sways slightly, then steadies, as if breathing in rhythm with the quiet around it. The shadows stretch long, then soften, then disappear, until all is washed in a muted calm. In this quiet, your breath finds its own slower pace, in and out, in and out. With every exhale, the body releases the weight of the day, and with every inhale, it sinks deeper into comfort. There is nothing left to hold on to, no thought to chase, no story to follow, only the simple rhythm of stillness. The past has folded itself away like parchment rolled and tied, resting untouched on a quiet shelf. What lingers now is only peace, a space made for rest, for dreams, for sleep. As the last threads of the story drift away, you may notice how your mind begins to soften too, its edges blurred, its pace slowed. Thoughts grow lighter, fainter, until they too dissolve. There is no need to listen any longer, no need to follow anything at all. You are carried now on the calm itself, into a place where time has no weight, where the night holds you gently, and where sleep arrives as naturally as the closing of eyes. All is still, all is calm, all is well.